If you can hear me, take an encryption button off the trial.
Hello, True Spies listeners. Welcome back to our new assignment, True Spies Debrief. If you were a child in the past 40 or 50 years, you likely read books like The BFG or Matilda or James and the Giant Peach. Or maybe you enjoyed Charlie and the Chocolate Factory with Gene Wilder or Timothy Chalamet. Or the recent Wes Anderson films, such as The Wonderful Story of Henry Sugar. All of these stories emerged from the imagination of one man, one spy. Writer Aaron Tracy tells the surprising tale in his podcast series, The Secret World of Roald Dahl. And this week, True Spies producer Morgan Childs chats with Aaron about the legendary author's life in espionage.
So, Aaron, in full transparency, for years I have known that Roald Dahl was a complicated person, and yet I have put my hands over my ears and eyes because I know that there are skeletons in this man's closet, and there's no book that I've loved in my life as much as Matilda, probably. So I bring this up because I don't think I'm alone in that feeling. So I want to ask you, knowing that you're doing kind of triggering work around a really beloved author, why dig up the story of this writer? What were you trying to do with this series?
Yeah. The anti-Semitism question concerning Roald Dahl is very close to my heart, but it's not the reason that I wanted to tackle Dahl. There's a Broadway play, actually, that has just begun, that started in England and transferred to the West End, that won all the Olivier Awards last year, specifically about Dahl's anti-Semitism. And I think that work by Mark Rosenblatt does a really great job of diving into those thorny questions about Dahl's anti-Semitism. For me, I was really interested in sort of getting a whole picture of the man. He lived this really, really strange, interesting life. I think probably most people don't know, he didn't write his first children's book until his late 40s. So he had all of these lives before that. And of course, they very much informed his later writing. But that's what I was most interested in, sort of his constant search for identity, which you see in the various chapters of his life. And sadly, they did lead him to a place of bigotry and anti-Semitism. He was a really difficult guy. It doesn't, for me, I can't really locate the anti-Semitism in the books. If I could, I think it would be very easy for me simply to discard the books and certainly not give them to my kids. Some people say they see the anti-Semitism in The Witches and in a couple of the other short stories. I'm not sure I agree. And if I can't locate it in the books, then am I being a hypocrite by not sharing his books with my kids when I'm very happy to continue watching movies and read books by people that we now know were absolute monsters? It's something I definitely have been grappling with and talk about a bunch on the podcast.
I'm curious, because the bulk of your work is audio drama and audio fiction, why take on a nonfiction project?
It's a great question. My favorite part of any of my projects is the research.
Yeah.
And this required a lot of research, which was, of course, incredibly fun, watching the Dahl adaptations and reading the Dahl books. And I have 11 books stacked up over here about Dahl's life, a couple of them by Dahl himself. So I really enjoyed that. A lot of my work has been writing for TV, writing audio drama. Audio drama is in a little bit of a weird place right now. I think it's always occupied this sort of weird little niche of the podcast world. Mostly it's just they're being made on Audible, which is great. I've written a dozen of these shows for Audible and iHeart, but I really like the idea of making a change and going more into sort of the more the mainstream of podcasting, the nonfiction narrative. And it's been incredibly fun. I've really, really enjoyed it. I still do my audio dramas. I've got 2 new ones for Audible that I'm about to go into production on. But this has been really one of my favorite things I've ever done.
Well, since you mentioned the research, let me ask you, because you say in the podcast that Dahl's memoirs are somewhat unreliable. So what was it using those as sources, and maybe what other sources were you drawing on?
Yeah, you always have to sort of double check Dahl. He never let a fact get in the way of a good story. He wrote 2 memoirs about his early years, Boy and Going Solo, which are fantastic, but they're very much written in the style of his children's books, meaning they are fantastical and pretty wild, and you can tell that he's exaggerating a bunch. And in some places, he's outright lying. To make himself sort of sound more heroic. So luckily, there are tons of biographies. I've got a bunch of them over here. There's an authorized biography by Donald Sturrock. There's a bunch of others by fans and academics and researchers. There's also no shortage of magazine profiles and interviews with Dahl. There's a bunch of clips you can find online with Dahl. So it was looking at all of that. I also talked to some people who knew Dahl in real life. I mean, he only died in 1990, so there's still people who knew the man. And so the research was really fascinating, trying to figure out what was real, what was believable, and what was more sort of fanciful depiction of more of what he wished had been the case from his 2 autobiographies.
Right. It's wild to think that he felt he needed to make anything up. But so he was a member of a group called the Baker Street Irregulars, or just the Irregulars. And I'd like to talk about how he ended up there. But maybe first off, could you kind of set the scene for us? Like what was going on internationally when a young Roald Dahl became a spy?
Yeah. So when Dahl was just 18, he moved to Africa and went to work for Shell Oil as a businessman. And this was sort of the first mask that he was going to try on, businessman, trying to figure out if this worked in the vein of what his father did. And he enjoyed it. He liked the adventure of going to Africa, but he soon sort of grew tired of the paperwork and the drudgery of it. And so he would watch all of these planes fly overhead, and that looked like a really fun adventure. So he jumped in a car and he drove to Haifa, and he volunteered for the RAF, even though he had never been in a plane before. And he became a fighter pilot, and he crashed many, many times, including one time that was really, really horrible and should have killed him in the Libyan desert when he was 23. And he was so injured that his superiors decided that they had to ground him. And they tried to figure out what to do with him next. And Dahl was this incredibly handsome and tall and charming man. He was a great storyteller. And the powers that be realized that he would be perfect for intelligence. So they sent him to Washington, D.C., ostensibly to work for the British Embassy. But in reality, he was working for the Irregulars, which was William Stevenson's group of British spies operating in Washington and New York. And it's this really kind of incredible group of these dashing spies, all men in their early to mid-20s, and included people like Ian Fleming and David Ogilvy, who would be the inspiration for Don Draper and sort of invented modern advertising, Noel Coward, the playwright, and Roald Dahl.
And you mentioned William Stevenson, who's also known as Little Bill Stevenson, not to be confused with Wild Bill Donovan. But tell me more about Stevenson. Who is he?
Yeah, Stevenson was the head of the BSC in America. He was in charge of the Irregulars. He had an incredible eye for talent, choosing Dahl and Fleming and Ogilvy and Coward, just these brilliant people who would turn out to be extraordinary writers and fabulous of all kind. Stevenson was, the best way to picture Stevenson is to think about James Bond, because Ian Fleming, one of the Irregulars, very much based James Bond on Stevenson. He was handsome and dashing and always incredibly well-dressed, very secretive, very charming, and Dahl worked directly for him. Their offices in D.C. were at the British Embassy, and in New York were at 30 Rockefeller Center, which is not where you would imagine a secret spy group to be located. It's where Saturday Night Live is filmed, but that's where they were.
It's so glitzy. I can't stress enough to anybody who hasn't heard the podcast how glamorous it is and how many luminaries and familiar names are in this story. I mean, you mentioned a couple of them, but maybe we could talk a little bit about the women who make an appearance in this chapter of this story.
Yeah. So one of Dahl's jobs for the irregulars was to seduce the wives of powerful Americans who were not yet on the Allied side. That was kind of the goal of the irregulars, to bring America into the war. This was Britain's darkest hour, and wanted to find a way to get FDR and America to come to the Allied side. So Dahl was rumored to have had affairs with incredibly powerful women, Standard Oil heiress Millicent Rogers, cosmetics mogul Elizabeth Arden, gold mine heiress Evelyn Wash McLean, the editor of the Ladies' Home Journal, an Oscar-nominated actress, and then the most sort of long-term affair, the most consequential affair for Dahl was with a woman named Claire Booth Luce, who isn't much remembered today, but she was as influential and as powerful as you get in the 40s. Partly because of who her husband was. Her husband was Henry Luce, who was the publisher of Time magazine and Life magazine and a bunch of other really important magazines at the time. He was sort of the most important media man in the country. And his magazines were often publishing anti-British pieces. And this was something that Stevenson and Churchill couldn't have. And so they wanted to find a way to influence Henry Luce. And so they sent Dahl to sort of have an affair with Claire Booth. Now, in her own right, Claire Booth was also incredibly influential. She was a reporter for major magazines. She was a war correspondent. She was a Broadway playwright. She wrote The Women, which was a hit Broadway play, which then was adapted for the movies twice. And she was also a congresswoman. So Dahl kind of struck gold. She was 13 years older than him, but she fell for him hard. And they dated for a long time while she was married to Henry. And Dahl's goal was to both try to sort of get Henry's magazines to publish more pro-British pieces, and also to get Claire to take down the temperature against America's intervention in the war in Congress.
It's really wild.
You know the feeling. It's been a long day, and the idea of cooking something decent feels ambitious. That's where Factor quietly changes the equation. They handle everything: shopping, prepping, cooking, and they deliver fully prepared meals straight to your door. You just need to spend 2 minutes heating them up, and that's a proper, healthy dinner sorted. And that wonderful convenience doesn't come at the expense of taste. The meals are fresh, never frozen, with over 100 options rotating each week. So you're not stuck rotating between the same 3 dishes. As for cuisines, there's a proper mix too. Mediterranean, Pan-Asian, American classics, and so much more. It's like having a dietitian and a chef quietly sorting dinner in the background, while you get on with the rest of your life. Head to factormeals.com/TrueSpies50off and use code TrueSpies50off to get 50% off and free daily greens per box with new subscription only, while supplies last until the 27th of September 2026. See website for more details.
You mentioned that Dahl is tall and handsome. He was young. He was dashing. I mean, and he was tall. He was 6'6", so he was really quite tall. But what was it about him that made him so good at this? You have some interesting details in the podcast about his relationships with women, and I wonder if you could talk a bit about how he connected with these famous women and influential women.
I mean, I think a big part of it is just he was a fantastic storyteller. He lived a really interesting life with all the sort of different chapters that I mentioned, the war hero and the businessman in Africa. And he would later go on to write really sophisticated adult fiction in places like the New Yorker and Playboy. And he loved talking about it all. He was funny. He was charming. So I think that was sort of like catnip for a lot of the women that he was aiming to seduce. His good friend, Antoinette Marsh, said she thinks that Dahl slept with everybody on the East and West Coast that had more than $50,000 a year. It was a goal of his, and he was really good at it.
Dahl said years later that his job for MI6 was to help Churchill get on with FDR. Could you talk about that line and what that meant?
Yeah, it was, as you know, the irregulars sort of had an undefined mission. I mean, their overall goal was to get America into the war, but they were sort of throwing everything at the wall that they could think of. They were coming up with propaganda ideas and sabotage ideas. Maybe my favorite idea of theirs was they hired a psychic named Louis de Waal to go around the country and publicly predict the fall of the Third Reich, saying that he read it in the stars, that the Third Reich was going to fall, and therefore America should feel more comfortable about getting into the war because it's fated. And so they were doing all of these different things to try to get America into the war. And Dahl sort of had a giant coup that came from what would later make him so famous, which was his writing. Dahl wrote a propaganda short story called The Gremlins, which was very much about British-American cooperation. And it was this really sort of fanciful tale that involved these little green creatures that would get onto the backs of RAF planes. And the story got published, and it got passed around Washington, and it got into the hands of Eleanor Roosevelt. And Eleanor loved the story so much, she began reading it to her grandkids, and she wanted to meet the author. So she invited 26-year-old Roald Dahl over to the White House. And Dahl, like he did with everyone, completely charmed Eleanor. She totally fell for him. And she invited him up to Hyde Park for July 4th weekend to hang out with her and Franklin, which, when you think about it, I mean, it's just so crazy. Like, for a 26-year-old spy to just befriend a lowly White House intern would be amazing. And Dahl, because this is kind of the way his life went, was making friends with the first family. And so Dahl was spending time with FDR and Eleanor. He was mixing martinis for FDR, and he wrote up long reports about what he believed was in FDR's mind and would send them back to London for Churchill. And so that's what Dahl was trying to do, basically give Churchill any indication that he could that FDR was thinking about, bringing America into the war or hesitating. It was a big part of Dahl's job to kind of figure that out.
Why doesn't everybody know this story already? It's so phenomenal. It seems like, given how famous this author is, that everybody would know more of the details of his life.
Yeah. I'm always surprised that people don't know the story. I mean, I think it's in the first paragraph of his Wikipedia page, so people who are interested in Dahl and have done a little research on him know a little bit about his life as a spy. But you're right. I mean, there's never been a big movie or TV show that portrays this period of Dahl's life. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. One reason is it's sort of always hard to write about writers. A lot of times writers just live more internal lives. So there are very few great movies about writers. But you're right. It's such a fascinating story, and I was very glad to be able to be the one to tell it.
We should talk a little bit about Charles Marsh. Who is he, and how did he influence Dahl's career?
Yeah, Marsh was one in a series of really powerful mentors that Dahl had through his career. One of them was William Stevenson, and the other was Charles Marsh, of most importance. I think Willy Wonka is very much a combination of Stevenson and Charles Marsh. Marsh was an incredibly wealthy newspaper magnate, just bought newspaper after newspaper, became a media mogul. He was from Texas, and he also became a kingmaker. He helped Lyndon Johnson win his first congressional race, and then supported Johnson throughout the rest of his career, all the way to the White House. And Marsh saw something in Dahl. So Marsh had this mansion on R Street in Georgetown, which he treated like just a sort of a a forum for people to come in and out. Secretary of State was there a lot. The Vice President was there a lot. Really important sort of movers and shakers in Washington. And Roald Dahl was there all the time. Roald Dahl became good friends with Marsh's daughter, Antoinette. And for a young spy, it was just incredible access. Dahl tells the story about playing poker one night at Marsh's house, and he was just getting cleaned out. He was not making a lot. His British embassy salary was very little, and he had something like 2 weeks' pay in the pot, and he lost it. And that was a bit of an earthquake for young Dahl. But the person he lost it to was Harry Truman. And so Dahl was making all of these incredible connections, which was just fantastic for a young spy. This kind of access was unparalleled. And Dahl was very nervous about Marsh discovering that he wasn't actually a British embassy employee, but in fact was a spy, was part of the irregulars. When Marsh finally did discover the truth about Dahl, he was tickled. Marsh had the same goal as Dahl, which was to get America into the war. Mm-hmm. So he loved the idea that Dahl was taking advantage of all of these VIPs at his house and was using it to help Britain. And Marsh became just incredibly important to Dahl. After the war, after all these sort of dashing, starry, exciting days in New York and Washington, Dahl went home to England, and he didn't know what to do with the rest of his life. He moved into his mother's house, and he helped on her farm, and he started dog racing. And I sort of think of it like we all know these people who just shined so brightly in their 20s doing incredible things, and then get a little bit older and maybe go back to their hometown, and you kind of never hear from them again. Dahl was losing a lot of money on dog racing. I mean, things were not going well. And Marsh saw this from a distance, and Marsh flew Dahl back to New York on his own dime. He put Dahl up in his apartment where Dahl could live for free, and he started making introductions. He introduced Dahl, most importantly, to Harold Ross, the editor of The New Yorker. And that is what jump-started Dahl's career, because Ross liked Dahl's writing and started publishing Dahl's short stories. So it's like Marsh is the kind of mentor we all wish that we had.
Yeah. I also think it's worth mentioning that Little Bill, or William Stevenson, he was the one who encouraged Roosevelt to build an American foreign intelligence agency in the image of Britain's, of MI6, which did happen. That became the OSS, which was the predecessor of the CIA. And it's just stunning how closely linked Dahl is to so many important people and so many important stories from the 20th century.
It's incredible. He's this Forrest Gump-like figure. He just, everywhere he goes, he triumphs. And we didn't even talk about in Hollywood. I mean, the Gremlins, that story that he wrote that the Roosevelts loved so much. Who else loved it? Walt Disney. And Walt Disney flew Dahl at 26 years old to Los Angeles and put him up in the Beverly Hills Hotel and started working with him at his studio to create a film version of the Gremlins. And it didn't work out, but it was Dahl's sort of entree to Hollywood. And I mean, who better to bring you into Hollywood than Walt Disney himself? Throughout the rest of his life, Dahl would just, sort of triumph in all of these different arenas with all of these incredibly starry, famous, celebrated figures guiding him.
So you've mentioned that he wrote his first novel for children in his late 40s. How did he transition? How did those spy years overlap with his career as a writer?
Yeah, that's a good question. If you know Dahl's biography, then I think you can find a lot of corollaries in his writing. His first book for children was James and the Giant Peach, but his second was Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, I think, is filled with echoes of Dahl's life as a spy. Willy Wonka, I think, is very much based on William Stevenson, the head of the irregulars. He's this very secretive man, this very enigmatic man, a creative inventor who took a young man, in the case of the book, Charlie Bucket, but in real life, Roald Dahl, under his wing and sort of gave him the keys to the kingdom. In The Witches, you have this sort of secret cabal of people. You can really see the spy stuff popping up throughout his work, but probably most obviously in the James Bond film that Dahl wrote. Mm-hmm. Dahl wrote the 5th James Bond film, You Only Live Twice. And one of the reasons that Dahl got the job when his Hollywood career was not going very well was because the producers knew that Dahl was a spy, specifically a spy with Ian Fleming, who originated Bond, and that Dahl would be able to bring his own experiences and outlook and history to the franchise.
I haven't seen You Only Live Twice, but I guess I'm wondering if I were to watch it, would I notice anything distinctively Roald Dahl about it?
Absolutely. There's a lot of sort of Roald Dahl touches in the movie. It's a bit cartoonish. For Bond fans, it's the introduction of the villain Blofeld, who you've seen parodied, even if you haven't seen the Bond film. It's the sort of the arch villain who sits in a chair stroking his white cat in his lap. There's a lot of those kinds of over the top kind of cartoonish moments that are reminiscent of details from his later children's books.
And it's a tough question to answer, but I'm curious how you think about the origins of that sense of humor and that sort of twisted imagination.
Some people think that Dahl's prickly personality and his wild imagination came from the plane crashes when he was in his early 20s. In one of the crashes, he crashed in the Libyan desert and his face went forward into the console so hard that his nose went back through his head. I mean, it was really just, he had to get several reconstructive surgeries. He had major brain damage that he had to recover from over weeks and then months. And that very well may have led to his very dark imagination. We don't know, of course, but it's possible. Dahl also had a lot of tragedies in his life. When he was 3 years old, his sister and his father died within a few weeks of each other. And later in his adult life, his 7-year-old daughter, Olivia, died. His son, Theo, was hit by a taxi in New York City and had brain damage and had to be in and out of the hospital for years. His wife, the Oscar-winning actress, Patricia Neal, suffered 3 major strokes and had to spend years rehabilitating. So all of that darkness in Dahl's life, I think, absolutely contributed to the darkness of his stories.
I want to ask you about the anti-Semitism that we talked about at the start of this conversation. And I'm curious how, sort of what you knew about him and what he had said towards the end of his life, and if your perception of him changed over the course of making this series.
Yeah. If you go online, you can see a bunch of things that Dahl said that are unquestionably anti-Semitic, both in a book review that he wrote and in a series of subsequent interviews where people started to ask him about the anti-Semitism, and he doubled down, going so far as in an interview in 1990, he said, "I am anti-Semitic." Dahl committed this sort of this fallacy that we see a lot today, which is he really didn't like what he was seeing in Israel. He didn't like specifically Israel's invasion of Beirut. Mm-hmm. But instead of blaming the Israeli government or the Israeli military, he blamed all Jews everywhere. Mm-hmm. His most famous quote in this context is he said, "There is a trait in the Jewish character that does provoke animosity. Even a stinker like Hitler didn't just pick on them for no reason." He went on to sort of spew a lot of anti-Semitic tropes, like talking about how Jewish bankers ran everything, and it was the Jews who controlled the media. I'm Jewish. This is a very personal issue for me. It really turns me off. Of course, it turns me off of Dahl. But it does make me interested in him. How did a guy who was such a hero in World War II, which is unquestionably linked to helping save the Jews of Europe to some extent, how did this same man become such a bigot later in life? He's a really complex guy. And, while I absolutely hate the anti-Semitism, I also have a ton of sympathy for him, for all the tragedies that he went through that I mentioned. And then, of course, Dahl did a bunch of great things. I mean, of course, there's the work that has inspired generations of young people to become readers. But there are also all these other sort of small romantic moments in Dahl's life. I mentioned that his son Theo was hit by a taxi in New York City. Theo developed hydrocephalus, which is like water on the brain. And there was no instrument that was capable of taking water off of Theo's brain without causing infection. It didn't exist. So, if this were me, I would have thrown my hands up and just hoped for the best that the doctors could figure it out. That's not Dahl. Dahl called a toy maker he knew, and he called a neuroscientist that he knew, and the three of them got together and sort of worked in what I think of as like a writer's room, throwing ideas against the wall, and they invented a new valve that was capable of getting water off the brain without causing infection. It's called the Wade-Dahl Till valve. And Dahl insisted that they not make any money on it so that it could be distributed widely. And it ended up being distributed all over the world and is credited with helping over 3,000 children. His family did apologize. His family also very much wanted a giant deal with Netflix. Netflix, according to the Hollywood Reporter, paid almost $1 billion for the rights to Dahl's works and have come up with some really fantastic movies, mostly directed by Wes Anderson. But yeah, Roald, from everything we know about him, he would not have apologized in his life for the anti-Semitism. So his family apologizing on his behalf, I'm not quite sure what to do with that. There was a big censorship controversy just a few years ago, and his publishers went into all of his old books and they removed a lot of the words that they found offensive, words like ugly and fat. Out of Dahl's works, but they went really far. They also took out words like black and white, even when it didn't refer to skin color. And of course, lots of writers stood up for Dahl. I mean, Dahl had been dead for many, many years, but Salman Rushdie, maybe most famously, stood up on behalf of artists and writers to reject this kind of censorship. I think Dahl, he would have been very unhappy with this kind of censorship, but he was willing to make changes when he felt that it was appropriate. So, for instance, the Oompa Loompas in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory were these African pygmies, and it was a racist depiction. And the movie, of course, had to do something about this. It was the 1971 Gene Wilder movie. So they altered it so that these Oompa Loompas were supernatural creatures, right? They were neither white nor black. And Dahl went back to the book and he changed the book to sort of make it more like the movie. There are times when making these kinds of changes because society has progressed are a good thing. I think of the Agatha Christie book, her best-selling book, had a racial epithet in the title, and it absolutely would not have been and should not have been published under that title decades after her death, or at any time, of course. But her grandson and her estate changed the title to And Then There Were None, and it's a huge bestseller, and I think the world would be a poor place if we didn't have that book. So I think that was a completely correct move, even though Christie was dead and wasn't able to make it herself.
In the very first episode of the series, you draw a comparison between hiring a babysitter to look after your kids and digging into that person's backstory, and then allowing your children to read Roald Dahl books, and the way you put it is worm directly into their ears, which suggests to me that they might have been dangerous, those books, for your kids. I wonder where you've landed when it comes to letting those books worm their way into your children's ears. Do you believe that they're dangerous?
Yeah, I'm so torn about it. I mean, I think it's really interesting that one of the best metaphors for it comes from Dahl himself. The BFG's whole sort of reason for being is to seep these dreams into the minds of sleeping children, which is great in the book because the BFG is this very sweet, beloved character, this very gentle giant. But in real life, now that we know that Dahl held all of these prejudices, it feels much scarier that his point of view might seep into the minds of my children or other children. So like I said, I can't really locate the bigotry in the text for the most part. So I don't have as much of a problem with it, but it's sort of something that every parent has to decide for themselves. For me, my children are not old enough yet for this to be an issue, but when it is, I think that I will read Dahl's work to them, but I'm also going to have a conversation with them so that they understand the context and understand who Dahl was. I had a conversation with Mark Rosenblatt, the playwright behind the play Giant that John Lithgow is starring in as Roald Dahl on Broadway right now. And that whole play is about Dahl's anti-Semitism. And Rosenblatt, who's also Jewish, still loves Dahl's books, still reads the books to his kids. I think this is one of those things that every parent has to sort of decide for themselves.
Mm. Well, Aaron, it's a phenomenal story. Thank you so much for being here to talk to us about it.
Thank you. I was so thrilled to be asked to come on. It's a really great show.
Thank you, as always, for tuning in to The Debrief. We hope you enjoyed that conversation between Aaron Tracy and True Spies producer Morgan Childs. More debriefs are available exclusively to SPYSCAPE Plus subscribers. You'll also be able to access other premium series, like The Razumov Files, our ambitious retelling of Joseph Conrad's Under Western Eyes. And for true crime fans, there's The Great James Bond Car Robbery, the story of the hunt for James Bond's most notorious set of wheels. Subscribers also get new episodes of True Spies early and ad-free. Subscribe to SPYSCAPE Plus at plus.spyscape.com. Disclaimer. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the subject. These stories are told from their perspective, and their authenticity should be assessed on a case-by-case basis. If you're enjoying this podcast, please click now to give it a 5-star rating or leave a review. Ratings and reviews help people discover the podcast and help us bring you more great stories. And if you have some time, why not forward the podcast to a friend?